Welcome to our Zoom lessons on the story of Jesus. My name is Jamie Knapp, and in this lesson, we will focus on heading south. Let's share the screen so we can get to the PowerPoint slides. According to Luke chapter 3, verse 23, Jesus began his ministry when he was about 30 years of age. And scholars tell us that the ministry lasted somewhere between 2 to 3 years. And to this point in Jesus' ministry, most of the activities have taken place either in Galilee or in the surrounding areas. Occasionally, Jesus would take a field trip outside of Galilee to Tyre and Sidon, maybe down to the province of Samaria, or go north to the city of Caesarea Philippi. But most of what was taking place in Jesus' ministry was happening in the province of Galilee. And through the eyes of his disciples, everything was going extremely well. The people loved Jesus. Jesus taught with authority. Jesus knew the law of Moses. Jesus knew the oral law, the traditions of the elders, but he spoke with a new voice, a powerful voice, a refreshing voice. And he was able to go toe to toe with the Pharisees. He was able to challenge them. And he was able, when appropriate, to point out their hypocrisy. And the people had to love that. Jesus cast out demons. Jesus performed miracles. He healed people. And everything just seemed to be going so well. And we have to remember, again, that this was not happening in Jerusalem, the religious capital of Judaism. This was happening in a rural province, Galilee, where things just kind of went along pretty peacefully and quietly and steadily day after day. Many of the folks in Galilee were just common people. A few of them, though, had acquired an elevated status, 12 in particular, the 12 apostles, who were going to be given power to do things that no one could ever have believed they were going to be able to do. And so things just really could not have been any better through the eyes of Jesus' followers. But Jesus then began to tell them that things were about to change. In Matthew chapter 16, Mark chapter 8, Luke chapter 9, this is the first time that Jesus tells his disciples that it's not always going to be like this. In fact, the Matthew 16 and Mark 8 sections of scripture, this is where Jesus tells his disciples about what's going to happen to him. They're going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to be tried. He's going to be killed and raised on the third day. And Peter says, "No, Jesus, you really need to stop talking like that." And this is where Jesus says in scripture, "Get behind me, Satan." In other words, saying to Peter, Peter, you have your own agenda. You have your own idea of what you think things should be. And in many ways, Peter's ideas probably were the same as the other followers. But Jesus said, we're not going to follow your plan, Peter. We're going to follow the plan that God has put in place. Jesus gives a second notice. Matthew chapter 17, Mark chapter 9, Luke chapter 9. He tells them again what's going to happen. Go to Jerusalem, and he's going to be treated harshly. He's going to be killed, but he'll be raised on the third day. And then he gives a third notice to his apostles. Matthew chapter 20, Mark chapter 10, Luke chapter 18. And they still don't quite understand. His disciples don't grasp really what he's talking about. In fact, Luke chapter 9 and Luke chapter 18 tell us that a full understanding of what Jesus was saying was concealed from his followers. Now, they understood the idea that we're going to Jerusalem because they had gone to Jerusalem many times. Jesus himself had gone to Jerusalem multiple times during his ministry for the various religious festivals and holidays of the Jewish faith, but they didn't understand the rest of what he was talking about in terms of what was going to happen to him. So the journey to Jerusalem begins, and as we've noted in a previous lesson, Matthew dedicates 2 chapters in his gospel to the trip from Galilee down to Jerusalem. And really, it only takes Matthew 1 verse to tell us about that trip. It says he departed from Galilee and he came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And then Matthew gives us a few details in chapter 19 and chapter 20. Similarly, Mark only needs 1 verse to get Jesus from Galilee into Judea. He went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. And then Mark gives a few details in chapter 10 of his gospel. But it's Luke that provides the greatest amount of detail. From chapter 9, verse 51 to chapter 19, verse 27. And beginning in verse 51 of chapter 9, Luke doesn't say, then Jesus went from Galilee to Judea. He says, he resolutely set his face to go to Jerusalem. Paraphrasing here, in a determined way, knowing what was about to happen, Jesus began the trip to Jerusalem. And then Luke provides basically 10 chapters worth of details about the trip from Galilee into Judea. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it is interesting to note these are stories, many of which we're very familiar with because we've heard them for a long time, but these are stories that are unique to the Gospel of Luke. The story of the Good Samaritan, chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. Jesus visiting at the home of Mary and Martha. The parable about what I call bigger barns. The rich fool who was quite prosperous. His land was very productive. He simply ran out of room in the barns. He had to store all of his of what his land had produced for him, and so he decided he would just tear down the smaller barns and build bigger barns. And within that story is the idea that he felt like he was now secure. He had everything he could possibly need. He was just going to sit back and enjoy life. And in the story, he's told it's not how it's going to work. Your life will end today because you're depending entirely on yourself and what you have and not on God. Parables about grace in chapter 15 of Luke, including the story of the prodigal son, the story of the rich man and Lazarus in chapter 16 of Luke, and in chapter 19 of Luke, the conversion of Zacchaeus, the wee little man who climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see. That's exclusively found in the Gospel of Luke. So as we bring this lesson to a close, Jesus is on the outskirts of Jerusalem. He's made the trip now from Galilee down into Judea, the province where Jerusalem was located, but he hasn't made his trip into the city. But when we begin our next lesson, that's where we'll start, with the entry into Jerusalem. I hope you can join us.